Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, and yourself?
I'm doing great. In regards to the current situation, I probably am doing very well
That's
with all
very
the
good.
challenges.
That's very, very good to hear. So may I start by asking you to tell us your name and share anything about yourself you feel comfortable sharing with the listening audience?
Sure. My name is Dr. Robert Horne. I am the director of the addiction counseling program at North Carolina Central University. And I have been there for about 6 years. Along with that, I am also in private practice. I am on the board of trustees for the National Board for Certified Counselors. I'm a fitness for practice evaluator for the North Carolina Licensed Clinical Mental Health Counselors Association. And so I've really been active in the field of counseling for about 30 years, both as a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a licensed clinical addiction specialist, and a few other things. I'll send you that. And also as a pastoral counselor, because I pastored for a long time and did pastoral counseling there. And so I love the field of counseling. I love working with people. I love working with children. I love working with people who have addiction concerns and mental health concerns, because I think we need that. And I think right now it's becoming extremely more relevant because of the pandemic and the mental health concerns associated with the pandemic. Aside from that, personally, I'm an avid motorcyclist. I do a charity ride typically every year where I ride cross country, sometimes up to 10,000 miles. Next year, I'll be going to Alaska on my motorcycle to promote mental health and addiction awareness. And so I love what I do.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Tell us a little bit about your academic background. Where did you go to school? How did you end up at Central? You can just, paint a little picture of that for us if you can.
Sure. I'm a first generation college student. And I always tell the story that when I went to college, I left with a one-way bus ticket and a Foot Locker. And I had this to see because I didn't have enough money to get back home. And I went to undergraduate school at Florida A&M, and I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina. And so my parents didn't have have the money to get me back home if things didn't work out. So I worked my way through school. And at the time I was also in the Marine Reserves. I had gone to boot camp the summer before I went. And so that has helped me a lot as well, because I'm also an active duty Marine Corps vet. And so after Florida A&M, I served in the Marine Corps for a long time. And then I actually came out, went to divinity school at Duke. And so I have a MDiv from Duke. And after completing Duke and pastoring for a while, I recognized the extensive need for pastoral counseling and more professional counseling abilities in order to serve the communities that I worked with. And so I went to North Carolina Central University and got my master's in agency counseling, which was the clinical mental health counseling degree at that time. And I just kind of followed up as I wanted to make a greater input in the counseling profession and pursued my doctorate degree at North Carolina State University. And so it's been a long ride. I tell people all the time, I'm a lifetime student. I'm always willing to learn, always trying to educate myself. And I think when you serve the public, you should always be striving to become a better provider of services. My model has been based on the servant leadership model. And so even though I've lead different organizations and have led different organizations, it's always about service to the people, because if you serve the people, then they will spread the word. And in the case of mental health and addiction disorder, I think it even becomes more important because of all the stigmas attached. So being a face in the community, especially an African-American face in the community of mental health and addiction counseling, I think has become extremely important, because there are so few, and especially among African-American males, because I think we make up only about maybe 1.3% or less than 2% of the counseling profession.
Yeah. That's very good to know. So let me start in asking, why did you decide to go mental health or counseling route in your academic background? What was it that you saw a need that needed to be addressed?
Well, when I when I when I returned home from the military, I'd done several deployments, and when I came home, I was trying to find myself
Mhm.
and that took a while. It took a while. And I went through uh, my own challenges, just finding myself. And one of the things that I did while I was finding myself is I worked at Greensboro Urban Ministry in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that serves the homeless population and people in need, and serves a lot of people that have mental health and addiction concerns. And so as I began to do that, I began to see a need there. And then when I was called into ministry, I saw needs in the church that weren't being addressed, especially among people of color, because people of color have a lot of negative ideas about mental health counseling, a lot of negative ideas about addiction treatment. And I start seeing those concerns, and people would say, well, African Americans don't go to counseling. And what I began to tell people was, no, they don't go to you as a counselor. They go to their ministers. They go to their religious leaders. They are for counseling, just not from people who they do not inherently trust. So they go to the people they trust who are in their community. And because there's so few people of color in the counseling profession, a lot of times people don't seek professional counseling. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to open the door and to explain what mental health and addiction counseling really was and what it means to our community and why we need to address it. Why it's not okay to say that, Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so is just like that. You know how they are when they show up at the family get-togethers. And we do that and we normalize that behavior, but that behavior is not normal. And people could live a much healthier life and a much more productive life if we address the mental health concerns. And not only those severe things that we talk about, but even in their day-to-day lives. I mean, in our relationships with one another, how we address our self-esteem issues, how we cope with the day-to-day stressors in life. And so my goal was simply to make a difference. It was really on my heart to make some changes in our community, and I wanted to be able to do it effectively and competently. And so that's why the education trend, you want to be the best you can be. And that's what I tell my students now. And along the way, North Carolina Central, after I got my Ph.D., asked me if I would consider coming there to start an addiction program. And so we now have a what's called the Criteria C addiction program. And I'm proud to say that I founded that program at North Carolina Central University. And that program now has typically keeps about 100 students engaged throughout across campus enrolled in our program. And we have students who are in the Criteria C, which means that they're on the fast track for licensure. And then we have some students who are just taking the course because they're interested in the addiction field, or they have an interest or a personal connection with someone who has an addiction concern. But this program, we've produced over a dozen North Carolina State fellows, as well as about 25 SAMHSA fellows, and SAMHSA stands for Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which is federal government fellows. And so we have an outstanding reputation for producing counselors, not only in the addiction program, but in the mental health program as well. We were rated as the top program in the Southern region back in 2015. And I think we continue that legacy today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to bring you to modern day times. So there has been a lot of talk, even in the political arena, where people talk about defund the police and all of these things. And then you have another side of this is where people think about how are police officers trained? What are the things that they learn? How do you get to a place where it's reasonable to you to put your knee on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? How do you get to a place where you can see a man running from you and you shoot him? You saw in Rochester where they put a head over a man that's having a mental health break. I mean, he's out in the street naked. That all that right there ought to tell you everything you need to know. You know, so
Yeah,
you go no
you're
further.
right.
Right.
There
So,
is no special training that's required
right. Yeah.
for
Right.
somebody to identify that somebody running down the street naked
Naked. Right. That's a mental
probably
health break.
has some type of mental health concern and
Yes.
needs treatment. And I agree wholeheartedly with that.
You know.
Uh, I think when you look at these situations, there are multiple situations that need to be addressed in these circumstances. First of all, I think the police are not capable of making those decisions on their own.
I mean,
I know.
what does that statement mean? Police are not capable of making that decisions on their own. What does that mean?
Let me give you an example, and I'll clarify that.
Okay.
Is that police are not trained to make mental health decisions and mental health calls. That's not part of their training.
Yeah.
And so I don't think they should be bashed for that. I think what we have to do is look at how we train police officers and then how we dispatch them. In certain situations, I know at Durham County is one of them. There are teams of mental health counselors that are dispatched along with police officers to help them make those types of decisions on the spot in the midst of that situation. And I think when they get calls in, that if something looks like it might be someone with a mental health concern, that a mental health counselor should be dispatched with them or sent to that site as well. And I've actually had that position in Durham County where I went out on the emergency calls when we thought people were suicidal or something happened maybe at a bar closing and someone was fighting, or when people thought that there was a mental health concern or an addiction concern involved in the police matter. So I think when we train police, we have to train them to use those community assets to bring people from the community into those situations before the shooting starts. And I think the shoot first, get the details later needs to be the reverse as much as possible. So that's why I say that when we talk about things like police training, that becomes important. I think when we talk about the systemic injustice, now systemic injustice, I researched this, I've published on it. And so one of the things that I look at, because one of my areas of interest, is how African Americans and people of color are misrepresented both in history and the current literature, and even the way that we're portrayed in the community today, and how that negative imaging of African Americans specifically sets them up to be abused by the system and each other. Mm-hmm. Because when we dehumanize each other, we do the same thing. And some of that is learned behavior, what we have learned from the system. And some of it is from training we have created in our own communities over history. You can read a book like Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome and look at some of the tendencies that we have incorporated into our societies, into the African-American community, and see how we have fed into this. Now, some of it had a good purpose at the time. And I'll give you a prime example of that. You know, a lot of times we downplay each other's abilities, and we shortcut each other by doing that. But traditionally, where that comes from is back in the days of slavery, you didn't want to be seen as being really good at anything because it made you more marketable. And if marketable, and slave masters would then take that child or that young person or whoever it was and sell them for a profit because they were a commodity and not a human being. And so African Americans kind of say, okay, well, no, you're not that good. You're not as good as what somebody else might be. They did that to protect their children. What happens down the road is that you create a situation where that's no longer a benefit, and it begins to negatively impact African American self-esteem, but it also validates to some European Americans, see, they aren't that good. They aren't worth all of that. And so there's a lot of psychological issues that go on in the imaging of African Americans. on both sides, because like I said, a lot of European Americans will use it to justify their lower opinions of people of color. And then some African Americans use it, not really understanding the psychological impact it has, not only on them, but on the community and the community's presentation to the world. And I travel globally, and I'm always concerned when I hear the negative imaging, the negative music, and all of that, because when I travel globally, there are people globally who believe that about African Americans. And I think we have to take a responsibility in how we present ourselves to the public as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So first of all, let me just get this on the record. I am a Central Eagle 3 times, so I got my degree in psychology, my degree in literature, and my master's in public administration at North Carolina Central. But of all the things that I learned at Central, so I'm an IT person by trade, but I never wanted to have an IT degree because I understood it fairly well enough to maneuver it. So I didn't need to go back and get a degree just for that. But one of the degree that had the most salient result for me was psychology. And what's really interesting about my psychology degree is I was going through the program, it was just an amazing thing to learn about how the human mind works, right? So when you mentioned the genetics and DNA, so there was an article that was written, it's quite old right now, about the DNA of slavery, right? So how you can, all the things that happen to you, Black people naturally have PTSD, right? So all of this has been branded on your mind and your gene pool that you have these tendencies. The question with that is that I don't think you could make a universal statement like that, right? So I don't think you could say, all Black people fall in this category. You have all of these pieces and parts we have to come back and think it. And so, you've got Jim Crow, right? You've got Reconstruction. You have leaders that you have laws on the books that gave them permission to discriminate against Black people. And then to further that point more, so you have people who are coming away from that. So, we don't have direct connections to our slave ancestors anymore. So that's in the past, but you haven't been able to address it. It's like the Holocaust. So when what Hitler did to the Jews came out, once they were able to win the war and all those things, they had an opportunity for making them whole. They had an opportunity. We've not had that. We have been persecuted every step of the way throughout our lives, even to this very day, so the murdering of Black and brown people to have such adverse poverty. And then you use that. I want to make one point, I know you're going to respond to this, but Nixon said something when, after he was elected, he said, he was talking about Mexicans. He was talking about Mexicans in America versus Mexicans in Mexico. And the person he was talking to said, oh, the Mexicans in Mexico are just great people. And Nixon goes on to say toward the end of this discussion, they're not like the Negro, who is just, don't care about home, don't have no family life, and when you think that a person that is leading our country would say something like that, really says all you need to know about why Black people are where they are and why it's taking so long for us to catch up to our white counterparts.
Wow, you said a lot there. And as you were talking about that that scenario, the first thing that came to my mind was South Africa and the reconciliation that they had there, where they had the reconciliation conferences seeking wholeness. Yeah. And Mandela was specific about that. It wasn't the cast blame. They said we need to have reconciliation so people can be whole. America has never done that. We have pushed it aside. We have created different laws continually to oppress many people of color. We have sustained systemic injustice. And this is why we see the riots in the street now. People are saying, hey, enough is enough. The George Floyd situation illustrated it on worldwide TV, that an individual could be held down for that long until he died, and there still be people who say, oh, well, that's justified or that's okay. The number of deaths of African Americans shot in the back, the Breonna Taylor situation, where an innocent victim is in the house and the police already have the person they're looking for in custody, and people say, well, why is there no justice?
Yeah.
You know, on the flip side, I was watching this morning where there was a situation with a European American male who had political ties, who was having trouble, and the police told him to stop, and he kept moving. They didn't shoot him; they tackled him.
Right.
And I thought to myself, that shows you how not only color but wealth and political connections influence our judicial system, and how police carry out the laws in different communities. The Reconciliation Act needs to be done here in America. We need to sit down and have an honest conversation about race, color, diversity. But what's happening now is that even the national leadership, America's national leadership, is saying, you know what, we're no longer going to do any diversity training in the federal government. We're not going to sponsor those things. We're going to pretend it doesn't exist. And it does exist. Everybody knows it exists, but we've gotten to a point where we don't talk anymore. And until Americans begin to talk to one another again, we are not going to have any type of issue resolution on these situations. And the divide will continue, unfortunately. And my personal fear is that it will become more volatile as we fail to communicate. You know, people always say the prime thing you need in a good relationship is communication.
Yep.
And I think we need to open the doors, and people need to be able to listen to what the other side of the conversation is. You know, and that goes to everything we've discussed so far. You know, I don't think we need to defund the police. I think we need to provide better training.
I agree.
For police, and if that means increased funding, we need to pay for increased funding so that they are properly trained, properly staffed, and then properly supervised by non-police officers, by community people in the community task force who supervise these things.
You know, I think the point that you made earlier about the ride-alongs, you know, I think that when the 911 operator dispatches the police to go to an event, he or she needs to have beside them, is this person calling because it's a domestic violence? Is they calling because some mental health? What is the reason? Now, if somebody shot somebody or done something like that, you dispatch the police. You know, I think you can pretty much say that that's a non-issue. But when the person, like the fellow in Rochester, when you have someone who's having a mental health break, and you send the police there, you know, if you I've never worked in law enforcement, so I don't have a good sense of this, but you know, if the police are fearing for their lives and where they're trained is to come home safely every day, it makes sense that they shoot first. The problem is they don't shoot white people first. They don't shoot other people first. They go in there with the agenda that this person is a violent, aggressive offender. So want to ask your opinion about this. So we have two epidemics, and I think it's still there. I think it's probably lessened in the news because of COVID. But when crack was out there, they didn't see that as a mental health issue. It was not. It was just poor black and brown people selling drugs and using drugs, just decimating their communities. Whereas opioid and methamphetamine is seen as a mental health issue, primarily because this is drugs that white people take versus black people take. So whenever you can frame the story to make black as negative as possible, and then to reframe that story to make white people good, you know, there's nothing about that makes sense. So why are there these two views of black people in mental health and white people in mental health?
And I laugh because I remember when the crack epidemic first started and how it was portrayed. At the same time, what people aren't aware of, during that same time period, crystal meth actually broke out too. And you didn't really hear anything about crystal meth back then.
Right.
But the crack they associated with low income African Americans, it became extremely negative. They were portrayed as being extremely violent. And so it became okay for them to be abused by the legal system. and taken advantage of by the legal system and denied mental health or addiction services. We didn't even think about that. Oh, we need to just arrest these people. We didn't think about treating them. But when we got to the opioids, the drugs that impacted middle class European Americans and prescription drugs, then all of a sudden, oh, we have to provide treatment. We've got to look at how do we help these people, and we made it okay and normalize that on a positive side so that those people could receive treatment.
Right.
And we still do that.
Right.
We still do that, and we've made it a system that once again is politicized and based on race and based on color,
right,
versus what's the impact.
Right.
Now, we could talk the same thing about alcohol and marijuana, and talk about which ones are better for your health or which ones create more problems in the community, which ones cost the system more, and they would be alcohol related.
Absolutely.
And I'm not promoting the legalization of marijuana. I'm just saying the equal treatment. It's what I'm promoting. And the legalization of marijuana is a whole nother thing with me as an addiction specialist, because I always say, well, when people say we want to legalize it, I say at what THC level? Because not all marijuana is the same. There's 100 types of marijuana. And I think we do need to address that and address it. And my personal choice would be address it and treat it like we do alcohol. And and have it at different levels, and then you start saying, okay, well, how do we manage this, and then how do we decriminalize the use of it at certain levels, and that's what we need to look at, because we've had too many people of color in jail for extended periods of time,
right,
and some receiving, some not only being in prison for an extended period of time, but some get out of prison sooner, but they have a felony charge and a felony charge classification that ensures they can never receive federal benefits like food stamps again.
right.
And they already have the felony record, which makes it hard to get a job. They have a classification that says, okay, you can't get government assistance. So what am I going to do now? That I'm out here unemployed, can't get federal assistance of any type, not even food stamps, can't even feed myself. I'm going to go back and commit another crime because I need to survive.
Right. And back into the system you go.
Okay. Exactly.
I want to, we have about 10 minutes. I want to give you some.
Oh, sure.
But let me just ask you this question. So as you look at where we are in society, would you say just the entire construct of race and economic well-beings are social constructs in a way, specifically for the Black and brown communities?
Well, race in itself is a social construct. It doesn't exist.
Right.
That was created specifically to show the superiority of Europeans.
Yeah.
And so they created a system with them being at the top and everybody else being less than. And by maintaining the racial structure, it inherently implies, even subconsciously, that, okay, this group of people is better than everyone else.
Yep.
Even though there is no scientific data to show that.
Mm-hmm.
We could talk about how that socialization process and how Black was made a negative image. Mm-hmm. And this association. We can talk about how that's portrayed in religion and the recoloration of God and Jesus and many other religious figures to be lighter than what anybody in their time period when they existed truly was. And I'm just saying that we have embedded so many factors to maintain the myth of racial superiority, that right. Until we address it openly and start calling those things out, we'll continue to have some issues. And so the legal issue and the police issue is only one part of the problem. It is the most prominent thing right now because it's in the media, but we don't talk about colorization in the job force, in the workforce, on your job, on my job, on college campuses. And we need to start looking at this across the board.
Yeah. I want to
I
ask.
could go on and on about this. I mean, this is an issue, you know, I write about this and research it. So it's near and dear to my heart. I think we have to sit down at the table and begin to have open and honest discussions where people are not afraid to engage. I will say this because a lot of people are afraid to engage in the openness when it comes to race because people are afraid that they're going to offend somebody by what they say. But we need to have a table where everybody can come. Let's talk about this and let's talk about how we fix it. Because if we don't, people will use that division and create tribalism and continue to play one group against another. If it may not be African Americans and European Americans. It may be African Americans and Hispanic or Latin Americans. You know what I mean? People can play one group against the other for their own purposes and for their own benefit to the detriment of everybody. And we see that being done today in our political society. And we need to just call it out.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that very much. We have about 5 minutes. I'm going to leave the remainder of the time to you to say whatever you wish to say we didn't cover.
Oh, wow. Most of my friends and my students know I'm a talker, especially on this issue. One of my concerns in the midst of the COVID pandemic that I think we all need to be aware of is that it has created isolated pods of people. And people are living in fear of the virus and fear of death. And in the military, there's something called battle fatigue, where the weariness of being on guard all the time because you don't know what to expect next, how that begins to take a psychological and physical effect or impact on people. But it also makes people more susceptible to tribalism because they're living in fear. And it makes them more susceptible to manipulation. Right. And when we do that, and when we're living in this environment, it makes self-care more important. We have to be aware of our own mental and psychological capacity, our needs, and we have to find a way to reduce that stress. If we do that, we'll not only have better lives, we'll make better decisions. We'll be able to critically think better and analyze things better when things come before us. So I would just like to encourage everybody to find a way to cope with your challenges and with your stress. Substance use has become one of the #1 coping mechanisms among all people. And many people get associated or attached to drugs because they're looking for an escape for something or they're in a stressful situation and just trying to cope. We need to find healthier coping mechanisms and we need to teach healthier coping mechanisms. And this goes for everyone, the police included, because I'm a big fan of law enforcement when it is properly managed. You know, I'm a big fan of all groups. I mean, I work with some of everybody. And I just think the stressors that we're living under now, we really do need to address. And it may sound like I'm rambling because I'm trying to get so much out in a short amount of time. but I just invite everyone to step out, talk to somebody, connect with somebody if you feel like, you know, the current situation is getting to you. Because we're living in a pandemic and we're living in a time of social uprisings and people are seeing all of these things on TV, and we have to worry or concern ourselves with vicarious trauma from what we're currently seeing on TV. Each and every day is just violence, 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 and rioting, rioting, rioting. Human beings can only absorb so much of that before it really does have a negative impact. All right, I'm going to stop there. Otherwise, we'll be here another hour, and you may have other things to do on your agenda today. But thank you for having me so much.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you were here. And I hope you'll come back and chat with me again, you know, because I think there's so much more to be said. And I think people need to hear these kinds of things because we make assumptions that may not be facts, and soon those assumptions become facts. And then we get stuck in that loop, and you're always chasing something that's not really there. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for chatting with me, and I hope you'll come back.
I would love the opportunity to come back. And like I said, thank you. Thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. And I will send you a link to this video once it's converted, and you can just let me know if I may upload it.
Sure.
Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day.
You too. Have a wonderful day. Take care of yourself.
Bye.
Be safe.
Yep, you do the same. Be safe. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.